and I'm just going to kick it off and introduce you, and away we go.
Once drugs become used for fun, they become demonized. There's also this sort of puritanical thing that nothing should be pleasurable unless you work hard at it. Isn't that outrageous? Something that was shown to be really promising as a treatment, as a way of exploring the brain, gets banned simply because it's changing the way people vote. It wasn't just changing their politics, it was changing music, it was changing art, and it was potentially changing health. Drug prohibition is going to do your kids more harm than a rational drugs policy. Scientists can change policy because judges rely on us, and if the scientists don't speak up and tell the truth, then the law will continue to be inaccurate and biased. You've got to be the first person on the moon, you've got to be the first person to study LSD using modern imaging. Someone had to do it. If you cannot change your mind, you cannot change anything.
Been on our radar for many, many years because, let's be honest, on London Real, we like to talk about psychedelics and the effects that other compounds have on our brains, have on the spirit world, and have on the world around us. And Professor Nutt has been at the forefront of doing research on such things as psilocybin, on LSD, on MDMA, and finding out how they can actually help us as medicine. And working with the Beckley Foundation, our good friend Amanda Fielding, they have published some extraordinary studies on how these substances affect the brain and what we can learn from them and how we can one day use this stuff as medicine. And David has a fascinating career. He has a fascinating viewpoint because he's all about the science. And he takes all of the hang-ups that we have as humans about drugs and whether we should be taking them or not, and really looks and drills down into the numbers. He was very famous for posting a diagram in '09 about the effects of alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, heroin, and the real problems that they actually cause on humans statistically versus the ones we perceive in our brains. And he famously came out and said ecstasy was more dangerous than ecstasy, ecstasy being horse riding. Because when he ran the numbers, he found that was actually more dangerous. And it's a great way of really getting you to realize that you bring a lot of baggage to the table when it comes to talking about drugs. And I think the more open discussions we can have about this stuff, the better. I'm so impressed by David Nutt because he's constantly out there pushing the envelope and talking about these issues and getting you to question your own thoughts about drugs. So I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. David got really personal with me and talked about his own thoughts, the history of LSD, the history of these drugs being banned by the United States and why that's hurt research. And it was a really thoughtful time. So I hope you enjoy that with Professor Nutt. It's been a crazy ride and one that we've enjoyed so much here at London Real. This week in the Academy has been pretty fun because what I've been asking people to do is to take out their phones from their pockets, to stick them in front of their face and record themselves for 60 seconds talking about something they're passionate about. And once you do that and upload that to your social media, it's incredible what happens. I actually did the same thing 5 years ago and we called it London Real. And so it's one of the weeks in our Create and Connect cycle where we get people out of their shells and just publishing them talking. And it's amazing, little changes end up making a big difference. And we now have hundreds of videos inside the Academy of people talking about their passions. And it really gets them to actually start taking action in their life, find purposes, find businesses, and it's just been so much fun to see. So if you want to check that out, come see us in the Academy. And now I leave you with Professor David Nutt. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Professor David Nutt, the British psychiatrist and neuropsychopharmacologist, specializing in the research of drugs that affect the brain and conditions such as anxiety, addiction, and sleep. You conduct your studies at Imperial College London and were once the chairman of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs before famously being sacked in 2009. I recently attended your LSD Revealed event at the Royal Society, great evening, where you unveiled groundbreaking research and said to me, if you want to understand the brain, if you want to understand consciousness, you've got to study psychedelics. Professor Nutt, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's been 3 years. So much has happened. I think you alluded on the last show that you might have been doing studies on LSD, but you hadn't done it at that point.
That's right.
I got home that night after being at the Royal Society where I saw you speak, Amanda Fielding, Graham Hancock was there, Rupert Sheldrake was there. It was a big night. And my 12-year-old always asks me, you know, what's a drug? And when I say what a drug is, she said, well, what's alcohol? And I get into this conversation and she said to me, why is LSD illegal? And I figured I would ask the source himself, which maybe is you, and maybe that's how we should start this out.
Yes, okay. Yeah, great question. I mean, LSD, along with the other psychedelics like psilocybin, which were made illegal on the sort of, you know, on the coattails of LSD, they're the only drugs to be made illegal because they were too politically dangerous. So these drugs were banned because they changed the way people viewed the way America was waging its war in Vietnam. And it's a remarkable story, really, because LSD was discovered in 1943. The real effects were discovered. And by the end of the 1940s, the company Sandow that employed Albert Hofmann, who discovered it, they could see what he saw, that it was a very interesting drug for research. And for about 10 years, there was widespread use. Sandoz gave it away. They made it as a medicine, they gave it away. There were 1,000 clinical papers published. 40,000 patients, I think, were studied. There were conferences, and everyone said, this is a great breakthrough. You know, we're really beginning to understand the brain, and I'll come to this a bit later on, beginning to use LSD to help deal with disorders like depression and alcoholism. And then, as often happens with drugs, it began to move in from the medical fraternity into more recreational use. And the real trigger for that was the war in Vietnam. Because a lot of young men were, well, when conscription happened, when people were being forced, depending on their birth date, to go and fight in Vietnam, that triggered quite a backlash. And you think about it, you know, you're an 18-year-old American guy, and suddenly, just because you happen to be born on an odd day of the month, you were going to be sent to this place which you'd never heard of until the war, to fight a war that you didn't understand, to shoot at people you would never see, be blown up or killed by them. And you thought, why am I doing this? And then there was a migration. These guys went to California and went to San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, started taking LSD, and realized, you know, there was a different way of viewing the world. And that cultural shift away from war that was induced by LSD, that was extremely threatening to the American way of life, you know, because up till that point, America was about ruling the world, being big enough, powerful enough to keep communism at bay, and use a military approach to control things. And people were saying, we don't want to do that, actually. There was this famous, wonderful protest placard, drop acid, not bombs. And that was anathema to the American way, which was, drop bombs and keep dropping bombs. And so the drug had to be banned because it was seen as it was going to undermine the whole political strategy of the states. And amazing, in those days, as sort of is the case today, but less so, you couldn't ban a drug just because you didn't like it, because it changed people's political stance. You had to find some harms. So there was this wonderful collusion between the drug enforcement people, the CIA, and the newspaper editors, or things like the National Enquirer. These scurrilous magazines, that are even worse than the British newspapers. And they concocted this range of absurd stories, claiming LSD was the most dangerous thing. Famous one, girl gives birth to a frog after taking LSD. Absurd.
You put these headlines up at the event.
I did.
And yeah.
And they're outrageous. And everyone, I think everyone knew they were lies, but politicians could say, well, look, if newspaper editors are concerned and they're responsible people, we should be concerned. So there's a concern about the drug, so we will ban it. But the most staggering thing of all was that it was banned despite opposition from senior politicians. Bobby Kennedy, Secretary of State, unquestionably the most powerful, intellectually powerful man, probably the most powerful man in America, would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. He says to he's the boss, he says to these drug enforcement administrators, sorry, 6 months ago this drug was a wonderful invention and it was helping us understand depression. Now you're telling us it's a dangerous drug and we're going to make it illegal. Excuse me, what's happened? What's the evidence? And of course they wouldn't answer. They just kept prevaricating and trying to say, to sort of get him off the topic. And in the end he got angry. He said, look, I think you're wrong. I think that LSD used properly, in medical hands, could be a wonderful, advance. It could be very helpful. But even he could not stop it. And of course what they did, they said, oh, well, look, we're only stopping recreational use. We're not stopping scientists using it or doctors using it. But they did. In fact, since LSD was banned in America in 1967, there has never been a study on LSD in America. Even though apparently you can, but no one has ever managed to work their way through this Kafkaesque network of blind alleys through the regulations to do it. So that proves it's been, de facto a ban, even if theoretically you can work with it.
So 50 years, there's been no studies since. 50
years in America. In fact, there have been only really 3-4 studies of LSD, and they've all come in the last couple of years. And 2 of them have been ours. Because it seemed to me, isn't that outrageous? Something that was shown to be really promising as a treatment, as a way of exploring the brain, as a way of even modelling some brain disorders. It could have opened up real new avenues of insight and research. Gets banned simply because it's not, it's changing the way people vote. That's outrageous.
What if the war had come 10 years later? Do you think it was just bad timing? If that had happened, could LSD maybe have been embraced? Or was it being embraced because of those turbulent times?
Well, I think yes. I think people were trying to make sense of the insanity. And they didn't feel they could do it. Well, they couldn't do it through the ballot box. I don't even know if you had to vote at 18 in America. You probably did.
I think we did.
But you were going to be, suddenly you're going to go to Vietnam. What can you do? You can't wait for 4 years to the next election. You had to do something. So some went to Canada, some went to San Francisco, others went to Vietnam and died. And I think, so I think it was there was a desperate attempt to try to find something that made more sense than the Vietnam War. So maybe you're right. Maybe if there hadn't been a war, although I'm not sure, because 20 years later we get MDMA, and there's no particular war going on then. But once drugs become used for fun, they become demonized, and even though that means taking them out of medical use. The the hatred that some politicians and some newspapers have for particularly young people doing something different, you know, it kind of knows no bounds. It overrides any kind of rational interaction, and even, you know, the concern that patients might benefit.
Do you think that whole aspect of something, you know, being recreational fun has this weird subconscious effect on our brain where we're like, oh no, you cannot do that, or there must be something bad with that, kind of the way that, you know, religious fundamentalism can ban dancing? And do you think it's almost an internal human reaction to scare away from these things?
No, I don't. No, it's definitely a reaction. I'm not sure it's a kind of fundamental. I think it's a learnt reaction, and the reason I say that is because, well, I can say it confidently, we don't ban alcohol. So we are quite happy. Bizarrely, we're quite happy for people to take this drug, which destroys their brains and their livers and turns them into crazy fighting beasts. We don't mind that, but we are scared of drugs which might make them think differently and be differently and even be better people. So I think it's, I mean, undoubtedly there is a fundamentalist attitude. There are definitely some people, and you know, America was a good example with Prohibition in the 1920s. There are some people who believe that everything that's pleasurable should be banned. Oliver Cromwell tried to ban Christmas. Was what got rid of him. So there are some people who believe that it's better to suffer on this life, having no pleasure, because you'll go to heaven. And of course that underpins a certain amount of Islamic teaching. But I think the current situation is more malicious. I think we have quite a sophisticated argument driven by the drinks industry. The drinks industry has spent a century mastering the arguments in favour of alcohol and against other drugs. And you go back to the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s in Britain, in the US. Pretty much every drug was legal. You could buy opium tinctures, you could buy cocaine drinks.
Right. Have you seen The Nick, which is a show about the 1900s in a hospital in New York City?
No, I haven't.
You might like it, but yeah, they're buying these things over the counter.
So everything was out there, and but the original drug was alcohol. Alcohol was the drug. Alcohol goes back to pre-Christian times, and the alcohol industry is a powerful industry. It's grown over the millennia. And it didn't like the advent of these other drugs, so it kind of supported concerned groups, and it gradually cut them off one by one. So, you know, opium goes, and then cocaine goes, and then later on cannabis becomes demonized after the Prohibition. And the alcohol industry has successfully reinvented itself as the sort of natural, tried and tested, proven recreational drug, and it's managed to squeeze every other one out. To the point now where in this country we've got this new act, which means even if a new one came along which is perfectly safe, it would be illegal, because the Psychoactive Substances Act bans anything that works on the brain in a recreational fashion except alcohol, which is a truly scientifically bizarre position. I mean, it's outrageous that Parliament could actually decide that we're not allowed even to experiment with our own brains, but that's what's happened.
And was that act passed to combat kind of these drugs that they didn't know if they were illegal or not, or how did this?
Yeah, well, it's a sort of sloppy law. They couldn't be bothered to work out whether something was harmful or not. They couldn't be bothered to define it. They just said if it's psychoactive, it's illegal, and it was you know, it's almost an infantile response, because it was based on a false premise, based on the premise that there was a lot of harm coming from these so-called legal highs. In fact, almost all the harmful legal highs were already illegal, but that didn't get in the press didn't care about that, because they just wanted to ban things, and they wanted to get rid of head shops, and even though head shops are largely selling things that are relatively mild and safe, because they don't want their customers to die, they want to come back. So this was a hysteria built up, fueled by the media, probably at arm's length fueled by the drinks industry, who hate competition, got into the manifestos of the parties without any consultation. The government's own advisory, the committee I used to chair, the council, the ACMD, they opposed it, but they were rowed over by the Home Office. And you'll be interested to know that that lady who used to run the Home Office, the Home Secretary, is now, as of an hour ago, Prime Minister. So I don't think we're going to see any more rational approaches to drugs in the next few years, sadly. In fact, it might even get worse.
The last time you were here, we asked you about David Cameron, and I think you had said that 10 years previous, he had said things that many politicians do before they're elected about how we need to reform, but that had all gone quiet since he was prime minister. Yeah. Now we have Theresa May in here, and you don't see that going.
Well, she's never said anything rational about drugs, and yes. What I'm hoping is that Cameron will now come clean and start joining us in lobbying for a more rational policy.
Well, I'm just curious, when you were the chairman of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, and you walked in there, and at some point, you published this scientific research about the effects of all these drugs, and you said, now hold on a second, let's be rational, let's be scientific here. Did you know you were always going to say that, or did you realize it in 07 or 08 and just said, this is madness?
So it progressed like this. When they asked me to join and chair the ACMD, where there's the full council, which is a mixture of scientists and police, and there's a judge, and there's customs and excise people, there's teachers, there's a whole range of community experts who are the full council. But underneath that, there's a special committee called the Technical Committee, and that does the science. So they asked me 9 years before if I would chair the Technical Committee. And I went to a meeting, and I was at the meeting, and I thought, this is weird. These people are pontificating on the harms of drugs, but there's no systematic assessment. It's just like, what do you think? Oh, I think this, without justifying. So I said, look, I'd take it on, but if I take it on, we would have to develop a structured form, a template for assessing the harms of drugs. Just like you would have a template for assessing quality of essays or anything. You want to know what you're doing. And they said, sure. And over a few years, we fought this battle because the old lot didn't want to do it. They didn't want to be held to account. But we did. We developed and improved a matrix for scoring the harms of drugs. And that was the first thing. And we published that in 2007. And that was in the Lancet. And that was called a rational scale for assessing harm. And that caused quite a bit of a stir because for the first time, we put alcohol in, and alcohol came about 4th or 5th. People said, can't be that bad, can't be that bad.
And this was harm to yourself versus harm to others?
This was the first one. This was a composite.
Okay, right.
So what happened after that was interesting. When we published that, a guy called Larry Phillips, he emailed me and said, look, you've done a good job, Dave, but you can do it better. We have this new technique called multi-criteria decision analysis. Never heard of it. And I said, I can help you if you want. And one of the other authors on the first report was a guy called Colin Blakemore, who by that time became head of the Medical Research Council. So we met with Larry, and Larry explained this much more sophisticated process. And Colin said, okay, well, the MRC will chip a bit of money in, and the Home Office chipped a bit of money in, and then we did it. And when we did that, and that actually came up with my original scale was actually a 9-point scale. We came up with a 16-point scale, splitting them down, harms to users, harms to others. And when we did all that, suddenly, ping, alcohol came out as number 1. And I wasn't expecting that. No one was expecting that. But when you look back, of course, it's because it's so widely used. And 87% of British people drink. And it's the harms from alcohol in terms of social damage and family damage, medical damage are so vast. And that was where the real trouble started, because then it was clear that, that all this, the government doesn't want to take on alcohol.
It can't.
The drinks industry has spent so much money getting politicians on side, and they used to buy them. When I first started, we did back in about '94 when I started working on policy. We did a survey in Parliament, and we discovered something like 3/4 of MPs actually took direct money from the drinks industry, and we asked them a question: do you believe alcoholism is a medical problem or a moral failing? And they almost all answered a moral failing. Now you ask them the question, you see that less of them take money from the drinks industry, but an amazing number take it from the hospitality industry. And so the drinks industry has moved one step away. So the drinks industry feeds the hospitality industry industry feeds the MPs. We've got to have cheap drink. Oh no, we can't possibly have more control over access to alcohol because the British hospitality industry was so. So they've got much more sophisticated in trying to keep politicians focusing on things that aren't going to interfere with drinking.
And so your study ultimately said alcohol and tobacco much more dangerous than heroin, ecstasy.
Well, no, it wasn't quite like that. No. So let's be precise. So
yeah,
alcohol, number 1, the biggest problem because of the huge social harms And then actually it was heroin and crack and crystal, and then I think barbiturates, and then it was tobacco. So you know, there are definitely some pretty harmful drugs out there that are illegal, like heroin and crack. But the drugs that the media really hate are the safe drugs like MDMA and magic mushrooms. They were down at the other end, and cannabis was sort of in the middle. And it's always fascinated me. You know, why do the media have such hysteria about things like mushrooms and MDMA? And you can't get a straight answer about that. But I think it's this. You know, why should people have fun? We're old. We're too scared to use them. Also, I think, you know, attacking those people is easy because they don't vote. Attacking drinkers. You write anything about alcohol control and they call you nanny state, punishing the responsible drinker, that kind of rubbish. You vote right, but you can write any rubbish about mushrooms or MDMA or LSD because, well, you know, they're another class or a different sort of person. And the same is true of cannabis. The reason there's been such hostility to cannabis users is because most of them are black and they don't vote. So you gain votes from the white middle class and you don't lose any votes because the people you're punishing and criminalizing don't vote anyway.
And that's a huge problem in the States as well, where all the criminals being published are, you know, it's almost a race issue. And then
it's the same here.
Yeah.
It's the same. It's not quite as bad as in the States where it was like, I don't know, 8-1 against blacks. Here, it's about fourfold imbalance of users to getting prosecuted.
Right. And then that kind of feeds into potentially the prison complex industry and the commercialization of that, which is happening in the States in a big way. I don't know if that's
they want it to happen here. They want to privatize prisons. I mean, it's. I can't understand how, you know, the idea that you somehow can make money out of people being incarcerated sort of doesn't kind of. It's a perverse incentive to put people in prison.
And
I mean, it just makes.
And you had that famous saying, and I just want you to talk about and clarify it, the ecstasy versus equisy. I always thought, as a scientist myself, that it was just a great point you were making in a scientific way. Can you summarize what you were saying with that?
Yeah, so when we were reviewing, for 20 years, we'd not been allowed, literally, been debarred by the Home Secretaries from reviewing the harms of ecstasy. And in the end, we were told we had to, thankfully, because a select committee, the Science and Technology Select Committee, said to us, you've got to do it. And we said, fine, we'd like to do it. Even though at the same time, the drugs minister, Vernon Coker, said, well, I don't care what they find, we're not going to change anything. But anyway, at least we were allowed to do the analysis. And when we did the analysis, you know, it turned out, of course, that ecstasy wasn't anything like as harmful as Class A drugs. So we were coming to the view that it should be B or even Class C. And about the same time as we were doing this, I'd had a patient who basically destroyed a chunk of her brain falling off a horse. And her whole personality had changed permanently from this brain damage. And I got interested in that because, of course, horse riding is a voluntary activity. You're not forced to do it. People like it. It's pleasurable. But it's harmful. And I started researching horse riding accidents and discovered actually horse riding is more dangerous than taking ecstasy. So I thought, well, the way to make this, you know, it'd be interesting for governments, you know, why would, if you don't care about horse riding, why would you care about ecstasy? And then I thought I'd invent, you know, as a sort of joke to make people interested, I invented this new drug, equisy, equine addiction syndrome. And it turned out to be a very elegant name because I published this paper, equisy, a new drug of abuse, a new addiction with implications for drug policy or something, and some friends of mine in Europe said it wasn't until they got to the second page they realised it was a satire, but it was, you know, but it was a satire that was meant to illustrate some of the paradoxes in our policy, because, you know, if you were rash, if you wanted to save lives, you'd stop people horse riding, but the world went ape. Because horse riding is a divine right of the middle class living in the countryside, whereas ecstasy is some evil thing that young people in cities do. I went, absolutely. I even got letters from Horse and Hound saying, did I not know that horse riding cures diabetes? To which I have to say, I didn't know that because it doesn't.
Again, I think it has something to do with our own versions of ourselves and what we're allowed to experience as pleasure too. And when there's a drug-related piece, we have so many hang-ups about it.
It's interesting, isn't it? And it's because I think, yeah, well, it's not this. It's because people are trained. You know, people are brought up to be scared of drugs apart from alcohol from a very early age. But also, there's also this sort of puritanical thing that nothing should be pleasurable unless you work hard at it. And it actually, I guess, to get pleasure from horse riding probably takes quite a lot of effort, because it starts off being terrifying. You start sitting out there looking down, frightened you're going to fall off, and if you do, you know, you're in trouble.
Have you ever had any statements about drugs that you've ever regretted saying, where you said something that was taken the wrong way about any drug over the years?
No, I mean, people do, you know, they do misinterpret. I mean, they want me to say that alcohol is the most harmful drug to the user. It's not, because if you look at the graph, it's the most harmful drug to our society.
Right.
It's certainly not the most harmful drug to the user. But it's still pretty harmful to users, but it's so widely used. So, have I really said anything I regret? No. I certainly don't regret saying equity. I mean, it was the beginning of my downfall, but it was an important discussion. It was probably my most popular paper, by the way. I think there's been 8,000 people who've downloaded it and probably read it, so that's quite a lot of reads, whereas most scientific papers get about 10 reads.
Your sacking now is almost a badge of honor, I think. It's almost something you're almost famous for and respected for.
I think I am, that's right. Yeah.
But at the time, was it devastating at all?
Oh, it made me very angry. It made me extremely angry, because it was, in retrospect, you know, once I'd actually published those first of those papers, people were out to get me, the press were out to get me. And I have a serious sort of anti-fan club. There are people who collect everything I write. There's a guy who wanders around with 3 or 4 files saying, I've got everything that Nutt's ever produced. I got him sacked. So they were continually looking. In fact, they knew, it's amazing, they knew that the horse riding paper was published before I did. Because as a scientist, you write papers, and then they get peer reviewed, and you get comments, and you change the paper. They go back. Editor says, "Yep, it's accepted," and then you wait, and you have no idea as the author when it's going to come out. And then one day, I remember it vividly. It obviously had come out that morning, because at 10 o'clock, there's this guy from the Telegraph. Do you stand by what you said about horse riding? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, the equity paper. I said, oh, has that come out? Yeah, it's just come out this morning. Who paid you to write it? Paid me to write it? That's what I do. I'm a scientist. I write papers. Why would I pay? Do you stand by it? Well, of course I stand. But they knew that, so they tracked me, and then the people tracking me, sort of trolling me, they went to the press, and the press then got onto me, and then there was this call for me to resign. And the same thing happened when the sacking occurred, because we then published the comparative harm paper, and I'd done a lecture criticizing the policy based on the fact it wasn't evidence-based. Did an interview on the radio, asked the question, which is more dangerous, LSD or alcohol? So of course alcohol is. The world goes mad, calls for my resignation, I get sacked. So yes, there's a lot of people out there that kind of who were very were pleased to see me go, because they saw me as sort of challenging this belief system of theirs that everything apart from alcohol is bad.
And then you kept going, and
yes.
You really started making the inroads to study a lot of these drugs, and psilocybin was on the list, and now LSD. And you, for the past 8 years, you've been toiling away at this, sometimes with help from the Beckley Foundation, others.
Bit of MRC help for the clinical trial, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you published quite a few studies.
We have,
and you have quite a team. Carhart Harris he's very impressive.
Yeah, he is. He's a real pioneer in this field. Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah. Why go after the psilocybin and the LSD? And what's been some of the reactions to your recent study?
Well, our research has it's come together because we've had this nice triangulation. We've had Robin Carhart Harris, who came to me 10, or maybe more now, might be 12 years ago, saying, I want to see whether LSD mimics dreaming. Oh, great, that's a good question, Robin, but you know, what experience have you got? Well, I've just done a master's in psychology. No, okay, well, what's a drug? Oh, I don't know about that. So anyway, we had to train him. So we got him a PhD doing some science. So he got trained to do the science. And then the Beckley Foundation came along, Amanda Fielding, saying she wanted to start putting, you know, see if we could do some research to really swing the pendulum back from being so far away from these drugs being useful. And I'm a psychopharmacologist, and you know, and I'd seen this history, and I'm interested, you know, obviously through the ACMD, I'd been looking at the harms of these drugs and realizing there's a mismatch between the harms and where they are.
And you were fascinated with LSD when you were a young man, 15 years old, or
oh, well, that's
younger
right.
than that.
So I can remember remember reading about Hoffman and his story about how when he accidentally took it, time stretched. And I remember thinking that is an interesting phenomenon. And that was probably about 67. So that was the beginnings of the Haight-Ashbury. Right. And you could see, I mean, it was obvious to a 16, 17-year-old, you could see that this drug was changing Americans. It wasn't just changing their politics, it was changing music, it was changing art. And it was potentially changing health. You know, it was obvious that this was a cultural phenomenon, the like of which we hadn't seen. In fact, I'm going to put a plug in here. On the 4th of November, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A Museum, they're having a conference to celebrate their new, they're going to have a new exhibition on the 60s, and the 60s legacy for the present day. And I'm going to give a talk on psychedelics and how psychedelics has there's almost no aspect of life it really didn't change, but certainly art, music, science.
Did you understand why it was happening then? Or even after? Did you ever think, why is it?
Yeah, because I think we realized, I think the Vietnam War, I can remember, one of my first images, we didn't have a TV when I was a kid at home, not until I went to university, but I remember being somewhere, and I remember watching the first draw of American kids going to fight. I remember it being pulled out. Was it going to be odd days or even days? And I remember thinking, those poor sods. Because, we knew, even though the press didn't want us to know, we kind of, you didn't have to be a genius to realize that the Vietnam War wasn't really a winnable war. In the early 1960s, it was clearly, this was not, there was no, didn't make a lot of sense, frankly. It wasn't as if the Russians were going to suddenly walk through and go down into Australia. This was a war fought on principle. It wasn't being fought on for any real politic kind of. And we all thought, thank God I'm not one of them. Thank God I wouldn't want to be one of them. So I remember that. I do remember that the conscription, American conscription. I thought, that's what a horrible thing to have to do. Because we thought, that war was over then. The last war we'd really fought was Korea. And we didn't want to fight any more wars, and well, thankfully most of us haven't.
And LSD, what did you learn on this study, and what did you think that was going to be true that turned out not to be true?
Yeah, so the LSD study was we did it for two reasons really. One was we did it because, having done psilocybin before, we come up with some very interesting theories as to how these drugs worked. We'd actually kind of turned the whole theory of psychedelics on its head, which I'll come back to. So that was the first thing. But the second reason for doing it is because it had to be done. It was someone had to do it. It's like, you've got to be the first person on the moon. You've got to be the first person to study LSD using modern imaging, because it had, and no one was doing it because it was too difficult and expensive and politically, challenging and maybe career-ending for people who started it. So it had to be done, like Everest, we had to do it. So those are the two reasons, yeah. And I'm really glad we did. It's an amazing study. It was a truly awesome. It was like a moon landing. It took us over a year of planning. We had to do it in Cardiff because it was the only place where we could do the two kinds of scanning. We did MRI scanning and we did MEG scanning, electroencephalography, and the same people, one after the other. So It was an amazing exercise. It was like we had to get it all set up here and then translate it, and we had to go down to Cardiff on a regular basis to do. It was truly a monumental study, and credit to Robin, because he basically led it all, did it all, and the results, well, they were as we put it, the psilocybin, when we first started, we had no idea. We thought we were going to find lots of excitement in the brain when people had these images, vivid images of coloured lights and things. In fact, we didn't. We found the opposite. We found the brain was switching off. With LSD, we found very similar things. But we found, because the study was a bigger study, a better study, we were able to look in much more detail at different effects of different parts of the brain. And we kind of confirmed what the psilocybin data had shown. But we also expanded it considerably to make sense of things which we hadn't been able to under psilocybin.
I remember one of the analogies in your psilocybin study was, it was almost like the conductor in the orchestra being removed, and the orchestra was playing its instruments in a way that, and that was kind of the way you described that experience, as opposed to more happening in the brain. It was almost less. It
was less control, and therefore more flexibility, more syncopation. So, and that's the same under LSD. And in fact, one of the most remarkable things under LSD was we were able to show the nature of how people get these complex hallucinations, seeing with your eyes closed. And what we showed with the LSD study is that occurs, that phenomenon occurs because the normal way the brain works is the visual cortex, as I'm looking at you now, this little bit of brain back here, the visual cortex, that's processing you, and I'm thinking, I know who this guy is, and I know where I am, and it's all kind of happening here. There's a little bit of crosstalk, so there'll be a bit of a brain which says, why am I here, and a bit of the brain when I was here last, but mostly it's all in the visual. Under LSD, the visual cortex becomes connected across the whole of the brain, so you can see, it can link images which created 5, 10, 15 years ago, but it can also create completely new images with bits of the brain which previously had never talked to the visual cortex, can now engage the visual cortex. And that's why, people can see sounds or kind of feel numbers and things. The brain becomes much more interconnected, much less disciplined in a way, much more flexible. And that's why it's interesting. And we think that's why people can change the way they think under LSD. That's why people actually didn't want to fight, because they realized there were alternative strategies. You can actually solve problems by talking with people rather than fighting or blowing them up. It's kind of interesting. Simple. It's obvious, but a lot of people don't think outside the box. They're brought up to believe there is one way and the right way of doing it. And in LSD, you can see things that brain would never allow you to see.
Right, and it connects us more and introduces that as part of the conversation.
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. Everything, everything. And some people become completely connected with the universe. They kind of float out the scanner and wander through, see God and become, very much more attuned with the fact that there's more to life than just this little rumination.
Yeah, you gave a really passionate speech at the end of that night, and we were there, of course, and recorded the whole thing, and you said a few things, and I'm just going to say them back to you because they were very powerful. And you said, those that cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Yes. And you went on to say, orthodoxy is the diehard of the world of thought. It learns not, neither can it beget, and an awful lot of science and an awful lot of politics are orthodox.
Yes.
And you were really firing some big shots out there, and to the audience, and to politicians, and to the world, saying, this is an example of humanity gone wrong for the last 50 years.
Yes.
And while this is a small step forward, if we go with it, we can make some real progress. And if we choose to ignore it, we could go the other way. Did I interpret
you
that?
Interpreted absolutely. I mean, yes. So George Bernard Shaw said, if you cannot change your mind, you cannot change anything. And that is such a absolutely perfect statement. And of course, one of the reasons I show that slide now is because we've had terrible trouble with people who can't change their mind. I mean, the reason that we haven't had any research in this field for 50 years is not that successive politicians didn't know they were wrong. They all knew they were wrong in a way, but they wouldn't change their mind about, they would rather be wrong and lie and keep the law as it was face up to the reality that they were doing a disservice. So the sort of political establishment wouldn't change its mind. And in fact, we were attacked repeatedly by a politician who was a pharmacist called Jim Dobbin, and he used to attack us for studying drugs, because he criticised us for studying drugs just because they were illegal. I mean, what kind of mindset is that? Why does it matter whether a drug's legal or not in terms of science? It makes no sense at all. So that kind of rigid mindset, which it pervades politics, and it would be great if people could think, I think outside the box, see a bigger picture. So that's the one aspect. And then the other quote, the orthodoxy quote, is a quote by Aldous Huxley. And I think he was talking about politics or economics, but it's just so opposite. Because when in trying to get scientists to engage with us on this, it's not as if we've these psychedelic research. I've said, I think this is in terms of brain science the equivalent of the Higgs boson for particle physics. Now the Higgs boson is big news everywhere. People kind of, even though they don't know what the hell almost no one knows what it means, but people wanted to find it and they found it. A lot of people, probably you and probably many of the people watching this program, are very interested in what psychedelics do in the brain. But the scientific establishment isn't lauding us. We had real trouble getting that published.
Yeah, your peers.
They're not saying this is a wonderful breakthrough. They're sort of saying, well, just let's not talk about it and let's hope he goes away. Let's hope we don't have to work in this field. Yes, let's hope we can get back to our rather simplistic view of consciousness. So it is actually kind of a bit disappointing that the scientific community hasn't really kind of supported us in the way that I hoped.
Right, and that was a comment on them. Two thoughts on that. The late Howard Marks, I know you spent time with him. We had him on the show. And when he was here, he said, Brian, I have a lot of friends that won't do drugs simply because they're illegal.
Yes.
And these are friends of Howard Marks. And so, they're obviously probably had conversations with a man who thought completely different. Yeah. But again, a lot of people won't change their minds because it's been prescripted in a certain way. Yeah. And like you said, the politician saying we shouldn't study these things because they're illegal is a fascinating circular piece of logic. Yeah,
and it is like what the DEA was saying to Bobby Kennedy about banning them. I mean, there is this peculiar. Well, maybe they're right. If you ban everything for long enough, people forget about it. There's certain religions that kind of, I suppose eventually you could destroy all the literature. You can. Yeah. You could theoretically, North Korea, I suppose, is an example. You can actually eliminate people's knowledge to a point where there isn't any. But what is the point of that? When these drugs could actually do enormously good things to help people improve their way and improve their control of their moods or their alcoholism or whatever.
Second thought I had, we had a gentleman by the name of Kevin Kelly here about 2 weeks ago. He's the founder of Wired Magazine, writes a lot of books on the future in AI, and he told me at the end of the show, he said, you're only as old as the last time you changed your mind.
Now that is a great quote.
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.
If you go into business, they stab you in the chest. If you go into science, they stab you in the back. Stay inquisitive, stay enraptured. Don't do it as a job, do it as a vocation.